Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second day of the Civil Rights Summit. If you thought the first day was fantastic, wait till you see what's in store for you today. The Workers' Rights Institute has its challenges, but they would be impossible but for the dedication and the commitment that we get from Georgetown Law School. Here to greet you for the second day of the Civil Rights Summit is my dean and good friend, William Treanor.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Dean.
Okay, well, thank you. I have to say, we are just so delighted to be sponsoring this incredibly important symposium. I just want to begin by, congratulating Mark for the amazing work that he has done at Georgetown Law. Mark came to us from the NLRB, and working with our Professor Jamila Williams has started our Workers' Rights Institute. And we are just so proud of the work that you have done in the past couple of years. The Georgetown motto, as you know, is law is but the means, justice is the end. And the Workers' Rights Institute, at this critical moment, has really brought such great leadership and, embodies our motto, law is but the means, justice is the end. So, I just want to, again, thank you, Mark, for what you are doing. And, thank you for the Workers' Rights Institute for the invaluable work that you are doing today. We're so proud to be co-sponsoring this event, and I'm really privileged to be able to introduce, Congressman Bobby Scott, who's going to be our featured speaker. He's a graduate of Harvard and Boston College Law School, and has made such a profound influence in his work in the House. So. Congressman Scott, we're delighted that we're able to introduce you and welcome you to this great program, and I look forward to your address. Congressman Scott.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Treanor, for your very kind introduction. And I want to thank the Minnesota Law School and the Workers' Rights Institute, Building One America, the NAACP, and all the organizations that helped organize this year's summit. I also want to recognize Mark Pence for his leadership as a former chair of the National Labor Relations Board and now the executive director of the Workers' Rights Institute. And he had compelling testimony before our committee last May on the need to strengthen labor rights, and that was critical in the passage of the Protect the Right to Organize, the PRO Act. This year's gathering of community leaders could not come at a more urgent time. Across the country, COVID-19 pandemic is highlighting racial disparities throughout our society, from disproportionate health impacts of the virus to the inequities in access to remote education. But to meaningfully close these gaps, we must look beyond the pandemic. As you know, COVID-19 didn't cause the disparities. It has exacerbated existing disparities of underserved communities of color, particularly in the African American community. For generations, state, federal, local governments have allowed or even contributed to many of these injustices. Accordingly, we have the responsibility, since well before the pandemic, to be part of the solution. That's why the Committee on Education and Labor, which I chair, is working hard to confront the roots of the inequities in our job market, workplaces, schools, and healthcare system. The first thing, obviously, we need to do that the committee has done to reduce the wage gap is to increase wages for those at the bottom. And that's why the House passed the Raise the Wage Act to increase the minimum wage gradually to $15 an hour by 2025. The higher education has also been the key to better jobs, and that's why the committee reported the College Affordability Act to make sure that everybody can afford college. That's how it was when the Higher Education Act passed, and President Johnson said that it meant that every student in every state could apply to any college or university and not be turned away because the family is poor. Well, that's not the case now. You have to take on crushing debt to be able to go to college, and the College Affordability Act will reverse that trend. And although we didn't, although it's not within our jurisdiction, home ownership is a key to dealing with wealth disparities, because that's where most middle-class families get their wealth gradually, and it's also generational wealth because it's inherited generation after generation. And so we have to reverse some of the discriminatory policies that are allowed to exist over the decades and make sure that everyone has an opportunity to buy and own their own home. We also have to preserve equality by making sure we enforce and strengthen anti-discrimination laws. And the committee has passed, and the House has passed several bills, the Paycheck Fairness Act to make sure that for women, the Pregnancy Protection Act, and the Equality Act for the LGBTQ community. We know that we have to fight discrimination everywhere. Martin Luther King said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Well, discrimination anywhere is an invitation for discrimination everywhere. So we have to make sure we're fighting discrimination to make sure there are equal opportunities. To support Black workers and workers of color, the committee passed legislation to strengthen workers' rights, particularly the right to organize. Throughout our history, the labor movement and the struggle for racial equality have been inextricably linked. With the United States pending entry in World War II, A. Philip Randolph led the March on Washington movement to demand equal opportunity for Blacks in the defense industry. Because of his leadership, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802 in 1941, the first ever presidential action to prohibit employment discrimination by private employers operating federal contracts. In fact, in short, federal contractors in receipt of federal dollars were barred from discriminating on the basis of race, religion, color, or national origin. In other words, organized labor has been partnered with civil rights organizers for all workers to achieve better, higher pay, better benefits, safer working conditions, and the ability to work and retire with dignity. In fact, the 1963 March on Washington was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and unions obviously were very much involved. Today, union members of color have almost 5 times the median wealth as non-union counterparts, and about 2/3 of the workers covered by union contracts today are women, people of color, or both. But Black workers specifically. Collective bargaining agreements can eliminate the racial income gap because in a union contract, everybody gets paid equal pay for equal work. Simply put, strong collective bargaining means strong civil rights. Unfortunately, persistent attacks on unions have weakened our core labor laws, eroding union membership and fueling the nation's income inequality. That's why the House came together in February to pass the PRO Act, the most comprehensive legislation in recent history to protect workers' collective bargaining rights. Ensuring that workers can decide whether to form a union without employer interference is essential because democracy in the workplace should be a right, not a fight. House Democrats have also introduced the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act, a strong response to the 2018 Janus versus Asprey decision, which prohibited fair share fees in the public sector. This decision undermined unionizing in the public sector among public sector workers by essentially making right to work the law in every state. Now, Congress cannot overturn the Supreme Court decision in Janus, but this bill works to provide workers in every state the freedom to negotiate with their employers. We were scheduled to take up this bill. Unfortunately, the House essentially suspended all committee consideration of bills unrelated to COVID-19. And when we get back to doing our work, that bill will be one of those that we'll take up. In K through 12 education, the committee is working to close a persistent academic achievement gap. Last April, we began work regarding the unfinished business to eliminate racial segregation in education, 65 years after Brown v. Board of Education. The GAO found that segregation in public schools today is as bad as it was in the 1960s and getting worse. And we know that separate schools have never been equal. Recently, the committee Democrats have been focused on ensuring that we do something about segregated schools. We passed two bills. One, the Equity and Inclusion, we reported two bills, Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, which establishes a private right of action to bring for people in localities to bring lawsuits challenging practices or policies that have a racially disparate impact. Because of a lawsuit, Supreme Court decision about 20 years ago, these suits can now only be brought by the Department of Education, and the department is not bringing such cases. The Strength and Diversity Act is a grant program to school districts who want to voluntarily develop school integration plans. As you know, in Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington, the Supreme Court set aside voluntary plans as being unconstitutional. You can do them, but this grant program will give the resources and technical assistance so that you do them right, so that you can overcome Supreme Court challenges. And to confront the pandemic, the House has also passed more than $200 billion in emergency education funding. This includes funding to address extreme inequality in our nation's school infrastructure, which I originally proposed in the Rebuild America School Act in January. We've also passed $1 trillion in relief to state and local governments in the HEROES Act, which is pending in the Senate now to preserve funding for public education. Without relief to state and local governments, they will be forced to make painful cuts to education to balance their budgets. In the pending Senate bill, there is no funding for state and local grants, state and local governments. And you're going to find that the state and local governments will have to cut their budgets, and the little money that there is for education in the Senate bill will only partially offset the massive cuts to education required by state and local governments to balance their budgets. And finally, to expand equitable access to health care, the committee is working to protect and strengthen the Affordable Care Act. This landmark legislation expanded access to health care for tens of millions of Americans and reduced the share of Black Americans without health coverage by at least a third. Unfortunately, the ACA has consistently been under attack by Republicans and this administration. In response, the House Democrats recently passed the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Enhancement Act this past June. This legislation builds on the ACA by lowering the cost of health care, expanding Medicaid, strengthening the protections for patients with pre-existing conditions, and the legislation also shields consumers from short-term health care plans, or what we call junk plans, that actually raise the cost of those with insurance and abandon consumers when they actually need care. These are just a few of the initiatives the committee and House Democrats have undertaken to address the nation's continued legacy of systemic racism. And it can be difficult to be optimistic about these proposals amidst all the chaos in Washington. However, we will continue to confront the pandemic. The House Education and Labor Committee remains committed to our ultimate goal of rooting out racial disparities and achieving equity for all Americans. In that, we all stand firm with our recently departed brother, Congressman John Lewis, and we want to work with you to make good trouble. So thank you all for participating in today's summit and for your good work to realize the promise of liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Representative Scott, can I ask you a question? We've been looking at all of the bill introductions for the last several Congresses, and we've seen your great leadership in civil rights across the board. We've seen your great leadership in trying to overturn the Supreme Court's decision in Alexander versus Sandoval and ensuring Title VI enforcement. In fact, your legislation is the most comprehensive and sweeping and far-reaching. Also, your labor legislation is the most prominent and powerful that's moving forward. So we're honored to have you here. We'd like to have your advice. We're a coalition of civil rights groups and labor groups, and we'd like to fight together for jobs and justice. And we see you as a great leader in those two things, one of the members of Congress that unifies these two areas substantively and powerfully in more ways than almost any other member. So we'd like to ask you, is there a possibility of a group taking some of your bills and putting them together, or creating a way for a coalition of labor and civil rights groups to support what you've done and to respond to what's happening in the country?
If you want to put a group together to help, we'd certainly be more than happy. That'd be great. And we can, depending on different groups, would have different priorities. But all the support we can get, the better. And more people speaking to it. Sometimes some of these bills get introduced, they get discussed in Washington, but nobody ever pays any attention to them outside of that. To have those voices that you have suggested amplify the discussion will go a long way in helping us to get the bills passed. They have strong support in the public.
Yes.
But you get the politics going on, and some people are appealing to, I don't want to be partisan, but the base in the Republican Party, and that's not the majority of the country. To the extent that you can amplify this so that everybody hears it, I think it could go a long way in helping many of these bills pass.
So you will continue, you can provide us some advice on this and work with us in trying to help you and create and support legislation that can expand and help the work that you're already doing?
But who's that contact person?
Well, the Building One America, is us. It's Professor Treanor. It's the assembled labor unions that are here. We'd like to work with you. We'd like to support what you're doing and bring the support of all the groups here together under your leadership to do something important for America.
That's music to my ears. We'll be in touch.
Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate your coming. We know you're very busy. It's been a busy time, and we thank you very much for your efforts here and your efforts before this meeting as well, years of efforts.
I think I saw my friend Ted Shaw on the screen a minute ago. I just want to say hi to him. I haven't seen him recently. Hi, Ted. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think we've got to move on to our next panel. And we appreciate your time. And now we're a little bit behind time, but we'll try to catch up a little bit.
All right. And Congressman Heilig, good to see you.
Thank you.
Okay. It's my privilege to get our next panel ready. I hope everybody's here. I'm going to introduce our featured speaker and also the moderator for our panel. We're very lucky to have Professor Taylor from Princeton here, one of the great young scholars in civil rights. And we've been particularly impressed by her brilliant book, A Race for Profit. Professor Scott discussed how, in the context of a segregated society, a deeply segregated society, programs that are instituted by private parties, sometimes that are seemingly benevolent, can result in even further damage to the poor and people of color that have lived in segregated communities for many years. She provides a sweeping analysis of the programs that were enacted after the passage of the 1968 Civil Rights Act, when at least many legal barriers fell. But segregation persisted, and she's going to talk about programs that banks and other private entities instituted in poor neighborhoods and their effects. Also, Julian Vasquez Heilig is the dean at the University of Kentucky College of Education, and not only is he a great administrator, but a very brilliant and insightful scholar, an activist in civil rights and in the privatization of public education through the charter schools. He's going to moderate the panel and also talk about his work looking at the privatization of public education and its effects on outcomes and racial disparity. So with that, I'm very privileged to turn over the panel to Professor Taylor from Princeton.
Hey there. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and thank you for the invitation. So I have a very short time to just try to outline some general ideas, and hopefully in a way that invites some constructive discussion out of this. And what I always like to do is to situate the specific ideas I'm addressing within a broader context. And so Now, you know, I think the context is obvious. We're at a critical juncture, I think, in the history of this country, as was stated earlier, but I will restate that the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed deep and embedded inequities in our society, in healthcare, education, employment, and most certainly in housing. The George Floyd uprising has confirmed the ways that these inequities have been exacerbated, protected, and entrenched by law enforcement and the wider punishment apparatus. And I think we can also see that some of the shock that people have in reaction to the disproportionate death of Black people because of the pandemic, as well as the furious response to police abuse and violence. Some of that shock comes from the depth of racial segregation in our society and the way that it hides the realities that millions of Black people, that I would argue that most Black people endure in this country. And yet, at the same time, racial segregation, even as it is so completely pervasive in our society, barely elicits any kind of discussion or mention, let alone any meaningful, prescriptive, programmatic responses. And so the questions remain: why do these conditions exist? How do they come into being? And why is it that they are sustained? And so this panel is intended to take up one aspect of this: who profits from these arrangements? And the first thing that I would say about that is that it's an important framing, because it moves the discussion about racial segregation and inequality experienced by African Americans away from a kind of individualist framework that just looks at these issues in terms of, do white people want Black neighbors or not? How do white people feel about the presence of Black people in their neighborhoods or schools? Those are not unimportant questions, but they miss the ways in which we can understand segregation. The persistence of it is also part of what it means when it helps to constitute a market. That in effect, part of our understanding of the persistence of segregation is that it is profitable, that there are people who benefit from the isolation and separation of Black people and the isolation and separation of white people. The most clear manifestation of these benefits has been the way that African Americans have been charged more, higher interest rates, primarily around their housing, but also through the distribution of all sorts of commodities and goods. Segregation has constituted a captured Black market. At the same time, conversely, white neighborhoods, exclusively white communities, have also benefited from segregation. In fact, the further white people get away from Black people and all of the perceptions about what it means to be in a Black neighborhood, the more value is accrued in white property in white neighborhoods themselves. There is value added for segregation for white people, and there is value extracted from the segregation of Black people. And so when we get into the specifics of who are the beneficiaries of these arrangements, there is a litany of beneficiaries, but I think some of the most clear beneficiaries, almost intuitively, are bankers, realtors, developers, and all of those who are directly tied to the construction of the housing industry in this country. But then there are also secondary beneficiaries from those arrangements, which include, frankly, elected officials who benefit from the lobbying efforts of these private sector, from this private sector endeavor, and really are the reason why, even when there are all sorts of there should be legal impediments to the kinds of practices that banks, realtors, and developers continue to engage in more than 50 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act. There's a reason why there's almost no meaningful enforcement of the existing civil rights laws that we have as it pertains to housing discrimination. But there are also other kinds of beneficiaries that in some ways are counterintuitive, such as nonprofit developers, those who are seen as taking on the task of building and developing low-income housing, who are also profiting from this segregated housing market. These are builders and developers who often have no interest in challenging residential segregation, who are comfortable building whatever paltry amount of affordable housing is being developed. They are perfectly comfortable building that in segregated communities. And thus there is a reaping the benefits of the continuation of this divided market. And so I think just to wrap up my brief section, that because there are beneficiaries to these arrangements and because we can identify them, this of course becomes part of the problem when private sector forces are recruited by public agencies, or for that matter, even when nonprofit builders and developers are recruited by federal agencies into public-private partnerships to develop more affordable or low-income housing, when these institutions have actually been a part of creating what I would describe as an urban and suburban, a metropolitan housing crisis in the first place. And so this is really, if we are seeing this as a moment, as so many people are, to rethink how our society is organized, to reconsider how our society is organized. This provides an opportunity to re-enter the discussion about what publicly subsidized, publicly built and managed housing could look like. What does it mean to take the private sector or to take nonprofit sector beneficiaries out of the picture, and to create and to see housing as a human right, and to create housing on an equitable basis where the profit margin, the capacity to make money off of people's suffering or people's human need off of the table. I think this is a prime time to re-enter into that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is Julian Vasquez Heilig, Dean of the College of Education at the University of Kentucky. I'm also a professor of Ed Policy Studies. So glad to join all of you for this important discussion, who's profiting. We have several panelists here today, and we'll have about 3 minutes to ask questions of each of the panelists or so. And we're gonna make sure that we leave time at the end. There's nothing more frustrating than hearing an awesome panel and not being able to ask a couple of questions. So I just wanna ask the panelists to try to limit their comments so that we can get some comments, questions also from the audience out there that will come in via various methods. So Professor Taylor, you write in your new book, Race for Profit, that real estate profits were rooted in residential segregation, and that the extraction of wealth through predatory practices is exploiting segregation. I think that really ties into my own work. If you look at public education, you see a legacy of school district boundary lines and recent research showing a $23 billion difference between districts that are majority white and majority students of color. If you talk about charter schools, you mentioned capturing a black market. Charter schools are more segregated than our public schools. They take a problem that we already have in our public education system and make it worse. And then the financial side of this conversation are the land and lease deals that go with this new market, this capturing the black market. It's really a post-colonial income extraction out of communities of color. So could you tell me a little bit more about this inclusive exclusion, and what do you think it means for academics doing research on this, activists that are fighting segregation through litigation, policymakers that are considering legislation, and how do we organize these different stakeholder groups if we don't make these ideas of capitalist extraction a bigger part of the public discourse?
Well, we could talk about that all day, but I think a couple of things come to mind. I think that in the academia, there was a period, at least I'm a historian, so at least within the field of history, of kind of recognizing the role of the federal government in perpetuating residential segregation was an important breakthrough. But I think that a lot of this history, but I think also in contemporary politics, really stopped with 1968 and the passage of the Fair Housing Act, that somehow the formal end of housing discrimination meant that this was no longer a viable kind of issue to dig into. At the same time, there was an inability to answer the question of, well, if housing segregation ended legally 50 years ago, why do our cities continue to be so segregated? Why do these problems continue to persist? And I think part of the problem in answering that question devolved into the personal decision and choices of individual residents that, well, these people like to live among these people, and, we sort of reduce these big structural phenomena down to individual choices and personal decisions. And so I think part of what is happening now, especially in the aftermath of the 2008 housing crisis, was a resumption of interest in unearthing of more evidence of the continuation of structural inequality in the housing market, that racism is just as visceral when you have Wells Fargo talking about ghetto loans to mud people, and all of this sorts of discussion emanating from banks themselves as a way to try to figure out how to push more oppressive predatory loans onto Black populations, that
Right.
this is no longer just a question of the individual choices and decisions of individual homeowners or renters, that, we are talking about big institutional forces. The expose done by, I can't remember the newspaper in Long Island last spring, that showed that real estate agents are just as involved in, on Long Island in New York, are just as involved in steering Black people to segregated Black neighborhoods and steering white people to white segregated neighborhoods. And so, I think that this is about bringing the focus back to the institutional ways that African Americans and other non-white people continue to be discriminated against in the market, not just because of personal prejudice, but because people are making money off of this, because institutions are making money off of this. And I think that when you talk about the sort of capitalist underpinnings of this, that is important language to inject into this conversation, because it imposes a structuralness into the discussion that all too often is lacking, and that provides an enormous amount of clarity as to why these problems continue to persist. This is not just, we've come a long way and we have a long way to go. This is about a systematic effort of those in the banking and real estate housing industry who have figured out for decades that a key to maintaining their bottom line is by maintaining a segregated market, a tiered market of which there are different fees and structures to enter into each one. And so it means that We can't just have a passive approach to civil rights enforcement, which we have had for the last 50 years. And you know, if we're serious about changing this, which people usually aren't, right? Because one would think that in a country of this size, of this wealth, that if you really wanted to undo a problem, you actually could. But part of being serious about it is creating the tools to dismantle what has been proven over and over again to be the source of inequality in the first place. So those are just some thoughts about this.
Thank you. You know, as you were talking, I was thinking about just a couple of days ago, the president tweeted, there's a tweet for everything. Don't worry, suburban voters, we're not going to build any low-income housing. We understand what the subtext of that tweet is. If you've made this sort of eloquent case for the structural factors that are involved with racism and the financial operations of our country. And I think that it's key that in that public discourse, that the kind of work that you're doing is readily available to folks, because you have administration officials that say that these types of processes are not structural, that it's a question of bad apples, so to say. But you really laid out a structural case here. Now turning to Congressman Gwen Moore. So glad to have you also here on the panel. You know, I've had some conversations with Howard Fuller about vouchers, and
Congressman Moore's not here.
Congressman Moore is not here.
Sorry,
So,
you should have gotten the memo. Sorry about that. She had to vote. She had to vote.
no problem. So let's transition to the American Postal Workers Union and Mark Dimondstein. So just in case you think we're only talking about housing, we want to turn now to work. You're the leader of the world's largest postal union. Of course, the postal union, the Postal Service has been in the news quite a bit lately. And when we think about the drive towards profit, towards privatization, this neoliberal idea that we should move our public goods to private goods, goods that folks can profit off of instead of them being a public good. Your members have had a target on their back for some time based on this read of the context. But we rarely explore the role that race and ethnicity plays in this conversation. So your workers have organized around civil rights. They've been a powerful engine of middle-class opportunity. In fact, my cousin, Misael Cosper, is a union postal worker in Lansing, Michigan. So King and Randolph argued that labor and civil rights, they have to be allies. We have to remake this coalition from the 1960s, labor, civil rights organizations, academics, religious leaders. So the question is, does that group, that coalition, have the same group of folks that are opposing this progress today, and why?
First, I want to thank the organization for inviting us to come on this panel. And it's a very deep and interesting question, Julian. Just, you know, the question of the relationship and the need for the relationship for the labor movement to be united with the struggle for civil rights and vice versa is still very much before us. And I would think that those same forces that opposed it before oppose it now. Just a few general points. You know, the corporate way to rule and to profitize and to laugh all the way to the bank is divide and conquer. It's just about as simple as that. And there's no bigger wedge historically than that division than white supremacy and the pushing of white supremacy amongst the working class. And of course, the answer for the working class, at least in part, and for the labor movement, is in our unity lies our strength, just the opposite. And that's what leads to more unions, higher wages, better benefits, dignified retirement, safer workplaces, many of the things that Congressman Scott talked about in his opening comments. One example of what I'm saying is the whole question of the historical roots of right to work laws. So right to work, it sounds fine. Everybody wants a right to work. But what it really is an effort in the workplace to undermine unions. And what it says is that somebody doesn't have to belong to a union, even if they get all the benefits. Well, obviously that undermines unions. It undermines the strength of the workers. Well, the roots of the right to work law were directly in the roots of white supremacy. A wealthy businessman, KKK, white supremacist leader of Texas, Vance Muse, is considered the father of the right to work laws. And many people don't know that. And he's actually quoted in print as saying, we can't have closed union shops. That's the opposite of right to work laws. We can't have where everybody has to be in a union because then white workers would be forced to be in organizations with, quotes, black apes. That's the historical roots of right to work that undermines the unity of the working class and therefore pushes all wages down. So that's, to me, a powerful example of why labor and civil rights have to be united, why working people and the labor movement have to fight against the divisions of white supremacy. Now, a lot of the questions and the subject that I'm supposed to talk on is the question of privatization and the question of race and the profit motive behind privatization. And Julian, if I start going on too long, just tell me to stop. The privatization has two aspects to it, I think. One is the impact on the community that's getting the essential services from the public sector, whether it's public transportation, public hospitals, public postal services, public education, public water. And so when we look at privatization, we often see that the profit motive is at work. For instance, the public interest has done a lot of good work on this. So they give an example in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, where the water was privatized. And it's a community largely of people of color. And the wastewater costs went up 3 times, and the water costs went up almost the same. And that's a direct hit on the black community, the community of color, and all the working community in that town. But somebody got the profit. And in this case, it was a huge private water company. Often these are multinational companies. The same with public transportation. In Washington, D.C., where I live, you have the circulator system within the public transportation system. It's a privatized multinational corporation, subsidized by tax dollars. And the public transportation system that the working people and largely the black community of D.C. uses, prices have gone up, fares have gone up, and service has gone down. And the multinational corporation is getting the profit. Specifically, the case study that I'm so close to of the Postal Service. The Postal Service has 28% of the 600,000 plus postal workers are African American. 12.8% of the workforce is African American. So one side's the community, the other side's the workers. So think about if the post office was privatized and the incentive to privatize. So some of the incentive is to get that public money, that public till that you talked about in the introduction. Post office takes in $70 billion a year of postage and postal services that are provided. Wall Street wants their hands on that money. So that's the part they want. They want a profit. But they also recognize that the unionization of the workforce, the diversity of the workforce, is an obstacle to them profitizing off of that money. So a lot of what drives the thrust of privatization, because it's always talked about saving the taxpayer money, it's not what it is. In the public sector and in the Postal Service, black workers have had an opportunity. I'm not saying it's all fair hiring and there's not discrimination in the workplace in the public sector. There is. But there's been more opportunity and there's more unionization, which uplifts African-American workers, Latino workers, and all workers. And so what in the public sector in general, 33% of the public sector is unionized. And a lot of that is black workers within that workforce. So when they talk about saving the taxpayer money, that's not what it's about. It's about breaking unions and destroying the opportunity, the limited opportunities that black workers have had in the public sector. Look, anytime, the bosses in the public side or the private side can use one group that's suppressed with less economic opportunity, less educational opportunity, less housing opportunity, less income and wealth, that suppresses not only that group's of wages, that group of people's wages and benefits and economic opportunity, it pushes the entire working class down. So if the post office was to be privatized, here's an entity that has equal pay for equal work and good union wages. We think about that in this key moment of Black Lives Matter. And how do we ensure that Black Lives Matter? Well, one way is decent jobs and equal pay for equal work, equal opportunity for promotional opportunities, and so on. So think about what's driving postal privatization. It's the money. We say follow the money. And it's some of the strongest unions left in this country. When I said the public sector is 33% unionized, the private sector is 6.5% unionized. Wall Street wants to get rid of unions because they get the money, they get their hands on the public till, as I said earlier. So if the post office was to be privatized, and this administration is in print saying they want to privatize the post office, i.e. sell it, break it up and sell it to private corporations. If that were to happen, the unions would be broken. The workers of color, the post office is over 40% workers of color, 28% African-American workers. There's Hispanic workers, there's Asian workers, East Asian workers. The good jobs would be gone. The equal pay for equal work would be gone. The dignified retirements would be gone. And a few companies would make a huge profit, few private companies. But what the people would lose is a democratic right, a small d democratic right, the universal postal services, no matter who we are and where we live. And that will have a huge negative impact on the Black community as well, because private companies will only go where they can make a quick buck. So if a community is already suppressed, already low income, private company says, well, I'm not going there because I'm not going to make money there. So privatization, at the heart of privatization, it's not the smokescreen of more efficiency or saving taxpayer money. That's all a cover for union busting, for pushing back the opportunities and the limited opportunities that Black workers and workers of color have gained in the public sector and through union life in the public sector. And it's about diminishing the services to the community and turning it over to the question of who can make a profit, whether it's our water, whether it's our public transportation, whether it's our public postal services. So again, labor and civil rights, we're a union that believes the struggle for economic rights also has to be part of the struggle for social justice. Economic justice and social justice are the same. We work in four walls of a workplace, but we go home to our communities. And what happens everywhere affects us in the workplace. And if we don't have the ability to rise together, brothers and sisters and brothers, we're going to fall separately. So only united we will be able to move forward. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. We're a union that's proud to be part of the civil rights movement as we are proud to be part of the labor movement, and the stronger we are together. And to get back to your original question, those who want to destroy unions, destroy opportunities for workers of color and Black workers, very much want to keep us separated from each other. And we have a really great opportunity, in my view, as a labor movement, to unite with the civil rights movement by being part of and being supportive of and being on the front lines with this uprising, justified, righteous uprising that's taken place in this country around Black Lives Matter and the fight for racial justice. And the more the unions are part of that fight, the stronger we will be in our workplaces as we fight for better wages, safer workplaces, and better benefits. Thank you, Julian. I hope I didn't go on too long.
Thank you. You know, under full disclosure, you know, I want to say that, you know, I'm the great grandson of a United Mine worker. I'm the grandson of a UAW worker, and I'm the son of a Michigan Nurses Association worker. So your comments are not are right on the money. You've really laid out the neoliberal playbook. Follow the money. And that people lose democratic rights when privateers attempt hostile takeovers. This is what you see with school vouchers. This is what you see with charter schools. This is what you see with the privatization of teacher training by Teach for America. I had a parent call me this week from San Diego and tell me that the Teach for America person there said that he was coming for the union. What you're experiencing in the Postal Service, we're really depending on you and your colleagues and your union this fall, early November. We're really depending on you. So now I want to move to the next member of the panel, Dr. Prentiss Dantzler. He does work on both for-profit and nonprofit players in urban development, redevelopment, and gentrification. And again, there's an important impact of this work on education. And we see in places like Chicago, where you have schools being closed under the guise of them being low performing, and then you have schools being opened by folks that have relationships with the policymakers there, new charter schools. You see land and lease deals, and you see developers highly influential, not just in Chicago, but in Houston and other places. And so as they seek to gentrify neighborhoods, while they close the public schools that are there, what comes behind them is selective enrollment schools, so that students that are living in those neighborhoods don't have access to education in the communities in which they live. And so your research, Dr. Dantzler, is looking at these themes of development, redevelopment, and gentrification. So what do you think about what Professor Taylor has written about? How do you see these actors throughout this landscape in different communities? And these actions towards privatization and gentrification, you know, are they helping or are they exploiting segregation?
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. I want to kind of do this, my responses in a couple ways, and I promise to leave a lot of time for questions. Part of this notion, and I think Dr. Taylor pointed this out within her book, but even in some of her earlier work, thinking about this idea of housing is not a human right in this country, it's a private good, right? And I think there's a competing ideology for how we talk about housing and home ownership overall that doesn't really get to the nature of how people exploit or use housing as a way to protect their homes, right? So her comments earlier about this idea of value added, but also value extracted, there's another part where we talk about value protected, right? So there's a lot of ways in which homeowners, but also parents, exclude different forms of property within their kind of metro areas. And when we think about it, it's overall competing with this like broader ideology that home ownership is the end goal, right? So in a lot of ways that we've promoted, constructed, and developed public policy has been based on this idea that home ownership should be the end goal for American citizens. And in doing so, we tend to forget that most places have different forms of housing tenures in terms of renters, in terms of co-ops, in terms of community land trusts, that should be in a what we call an equitable society, a more sustainable approach in terms of housing policy. When we look at it in terms of schools, as you were noting, a lot of it deals with how parents actually feel about new low-income students. Typically, when they're seen under the guise, right, that is a low-income students coming into their neighborhoods. But we understand at the root of that these ideas are deeply racialized. So I think part of the kind of notion that we have in terms of housing policy and why we see so many issues around housing insecurity, but also housing affordability, is still built on this overall assumption that homeownership should be the end goal for most Americans, and that housing is not a human right, but a private good. The other part that I think she did, or I would argue that she did beautifully in a book, is to describe like the nature of how different organizations interact and collaborate with local and federal governments to increase their financial streams to develop different types of housing products, right? So we see in terms of the Great Recession, in terms of subprime lending, we see a lot of those kind of products were targeted to Black and brown communities overall. We say that even today, when we talk about processes like eviction processes, that Black and brown communities are more highly likely to experience those type of situations. And even when we think about things like gentrification, where the same neighborhood could be seen as problematic disadvantage, and it seems to be that overnight they become this new kind of wake of investment, right? And a lot of the ways in which we see this is that there are collaborations that happen between local policymakers, but also private entities to reshape and recreate narratives about what neighborhoods are good and what neighborhoods are bad. And I think part of the kind of the issue or the tension that we're dealing with right now is that we fail to realize that renters have a place in communities just like homeowners, right? We tend to have like these this kind of isolated approaches to housing policy. And as a result, instead of developing sustainable, equitable communities, we get to these points by which that we're creating communities for particular types of people. And then as a result, anybody trying to drive or strive for that dream, or that American dream in terms of home ownership, we see that racialized groups or racial groups tend to be to bear the brunt of those issues. So I think a lot of ways in which we see profit making tends to be around this idea that we just don't see housing as a human right in this country. And to push for different legislation around affordable housing, that still leaves out a larger sect of people who don't fit into those neighborhoods, who are not even eligible to occupy those units. So in kind of thinking about how to reshape these changes, I would argue that we need to think about a housing structure that is inclusive of different types of housing tenure, but also how does that relate to individual urban development growth, where policymakers are using different tools to drive a revenue through tax revenue from property taxes.
Great. Thank you so much for talking about the evolving conversation around gentrification. We now have time for some questions. And I think we have academics, we have policymakers, we have lots of folks here on this call. And I think words are really important, but actions are what is powerful. So I'm going to toss a question out to the panel. We can popcorn the responses. What should we be doing? What kind of policies, coalition, organizing? What do you think, what kind of action should we be taking?
Julian?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So on a very sort of a narrow way, but a very specific way, the country is in a fork in the road on whether there's going to be a public postal service or whether this administration, the Heritage Foundation, Wall Street is going to privatize it. So one very concrete thing that's going on, and it's an example of a coalition that can be spread much larger, is the unity of the civil rights movement and the labor movement, particularly the postal unions, but the entire labor movement, around that defense of the public commons, the defense of the unions, and the defense of the diverse workforce, the largely Black, and people of color workforce to maintain their union rights and their decent family sustaining union jobs. The postal workers cannot win this fight alone. You have to have coalition. We have a grand alliance to save our public postal service. A key part of that alliance is the civil rights community that have both the understanding what public postal services mean to the community and to the workers. Without those alliances, we're gonna fall separately, and the postal service will likely be privatized, something that's been part of this country before the founding of the country. So that's just a very kind of narrow example, but I hopefully it's something to think about because it underscores the need for alliances, for coalitions, and if we truly are practicing solidarity, a foundation of our labor movement, and if we expect the community to stand with us as postal workers in defense of our jobs and unions, then we have to be there standing with the communities in defense of their rights, whether it's in relation to taking the militarization of police forces and all the money into that and turning it back into the community, whether it's access to good jobs, whether it's unionization and organizing, whether it's fair housing. We have to be there because that's what solidarity is all about, and that's how we build together.
Okay. Great, wonderful. We have some questions from.
Can I just say something to that?
Go ahead.
Really quick?
Go ahead.
Because I think that we have to have short-term and long-term goals. And the short-term is that, at least in the realm of housing, is that we are on the precipice of a housing catastrophe in this country. Housing has been bad for people. It has been expensive, unaffordable, because of all of the reasons that Dr. Dantzler talked about, which is housing in this country is a commodity, it's not a right. And so now when you layer the problems of the pandemic have exacerbated onto that, we are facing a housing catastrophe. So in terms of what needs to happen now, we have to, form coalitions, protests, demonstrations, whatever, to stop the mass eviction from people of people from their homes when these statewide and federal moratoria expire. So that's one thing. We have to fight for rent and debt forgiveness. And not this idea that we can kick the debt can down the road and that somehow the millions of people who are unemployed now, who have drained whatever meager savings, if they had any savings in the first place, now will somehow be able to pay thousands of dollars in debt months from now is ridiculous. So we have to have debt forgiveness. And then in the long term, I think that it is about action, but it is also that we have to engage in an ideological struggle that reasserts the need for a public sector. And it's not just the post office, it's about public housing, public health, public education. All of these things are under attack. And I think it's important to say, it's not just the right. It's not just if we get rid of Donald Trump, we will return to some kind of utopian paradise that preceded him. No, there's been a bipartisan attack on the public sector, on a local level, on the city level. In the cities, it's the Democratic Party that is destroying the public sector. And so we have to have an ideological struggle that reasserts public control, public oversight, public funding as a human right, that people have a right to live somewhere. People have a right to health care. People have a right to food and to be educated. But that is a set of ideas that actually has to be fought for. And then we have to fight for its actual expression in terms of policy. And we have to build decommodified housing that is not on the market. We have to recommit to public education that is not commodified and not on the market. And so that requires a political and ideological struggle, as well as then fighting programmatically and policy-wise to bring it into existence.
Thank you so much.
Very well said.
We have a question here from Paul Bellenboyer, and that question is a dovetail to this. Housing and home ownership dominate the landscape of modern segregation, wealth gap, education, job opportunities, and profiting from segregation. What's the best point of attack? So dovetailing, what do you think that best, is it with policymakers, is it coalitions? What's that best point of attack?
I'll take a swing at this one. I think part of it is that, just to echo kind of Dr. Taylor's point, right? A lot of the subsidies that go to housing policy don't go to low income programs, right? They don't go to housing assistance programs. Most of the time, we largely subsidize home ownership as the dominant form of housing tenure in this country. And until we redirect funding from a stronger public sector, then we won't get to the same types of ideas. We won't get the same types of outcomes that we're usually fighting for in these constructions. I think part of the other struggle that we tend to talk about in this case is that what does it look like to rethink the role of the government, right? So given the historic racist history of federal policy within this country, we have to rethink or reanalyze what the federal government and even government really should be doing. And in doing so, you can get to some of these other kind of natures or some of these nuances that we see at the local level. The other part in terms of this country is if homeownership is so tied to this, homeownership is one of the few commodities that we say for asset building that we largely protect, and we never problematize people from going into risk-based lending practices, from risky mortgage programs. And a lot of ways, the federal government builds that up. So I think part of it is that you have to build, like Dr. Taylor said, a coalition to radically rethink the public sector and their role in actually providing public housing, housing vouchers, which are still a neoliberal tool, right? So it's pretty much a subsidy to private landlords, and kind of really rethink the role of the federal government in establishing a public sector that is available to all, while having the private sector not take control or take the primary approach for delegating public goods that we see in this country.
Thank you so much. We have an education question here. I'll toss it out to the panel first. With school segregation as a fact, in what ways can predominantly white school teachers and students focused on environmental sustainability be allies with school teachers and students of color who predominantly experience disproportionate impacts from these injustices?
Are you going to take that?
I can, but I can toss it out to the panel. Okay, so I think the best way we can think about this is allyship. So I think one is that within your teacher associations, that you support teachers of color and their associations. I think being involved locally with local and state politics, being an education voter, supporting leaders, whether they be educational leaders, superintendents, principals, etc., that are transformative leaders, that are focused on being socially just, culturally relevant, community engaged. We have to make the right decisions when choosing our educational leaders and be voices in those processes. So I think those are a couple of ways: being active inside your teacher association and supporting communities of color, being involved locally with politics, and being sure that when you make decisions about educational leaders, that you use the right criteria.
And Julian, if I can add very quickly, and I think I'm doing this in an accurate way, the Chicago Teachers Union, or the AFT, at least in one of their recent rounds of negotiations, and someone could correct me if I'm wrong, one of the demands was that the immigrant students in the schools be protected from any oppression, suppression, presence of immigration raids. So it was a concrete example where the teachers were uniting with the needs of the students and their families and said, this is about education for all in the public sector. So I thought it was a great example of how the union movement can ally with the parents and students, in this case, specifically around rights of the oppressed immigrant kids and their families and community.
Thank you very much. That alliance between parents and teachers is powerful. Going to the next question from Chris Sanders, is there new practical research on legal strategies, particularly litigation approaches, to break the present day legacy of redlining? I don't know if Dr. Orfield, he would be a great person to answer that question. Can he weigh in?
Yeah, sure. I think that one of the things that's been happening is we need, I gotta start my video. One of the things that we would like to see is a strong Justice Department enforce the provisions of the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act is a powerful tool that's almost never been used. It can go after these kinds of things. Private actions are harder. There's been a series of actions that have occurred against Wells Fargo Bank, particularly, and they've been brought by private plaintiffs with some supports from the city council. And they always get to the point where the banks try to dismiss them. They're saying that their behavior is protected, their algorithms, their data, their information is protected. And they won't, and once the courts decide they have to provide their information that is underlying their practices, they settle for large amounts of money, which private plaintiffs often take. But to really get at these practices, we need a strong Justice Department. We need to have legal aid and other sorts of groups be able to bring class actions. We need to figure out how to allow lawyers into court, give them causes of action, giving the ability to force this. It's very hard to do, but the most important thing would be to have a strong Justice Department to enforce the law that actually exists.
Thank you very much. There's a question from Tammy that says, thank you so much for coming together. If the short-term urgency is a need to maintain momentum and unity in the face of racism, which has a financial benefit to those in power, how can a regular person engage?
I'll just say quickly, I think that we've been seeing how regular people can engage, and that it has transformed the parameters of the discussion. And so I'm talking mostly about the uprising in June, but I think also before that, when the lockdown first began to happen, there were labor actions taken by quote unquote essential workers that I think was crucial in raising the hypocrisy of the framework of essential worker, people who are called essential workers but are paid as if they are unessential. And it brought to light the conditions of those those workers were experiencing, and also reset the framework for how we talk about rescue packages and for how we even envision what the federal government should be doing to mitigate the worst aspects of this crisis. Now, whether or not they do that is a different issue that has to do with the strength and sustenance of struggle. But I think we got an idea that once people are involved in political struggle and organizing in a very public way, that it deepens our understanding of issues where otherwise they are just glazed over in a very superficial way and moved on to the next thing. And so I would say that people should find the many different networks that have been established and groups that have been established or reestablished over the last few months to try to plug in, to figure out what is happening locally, what is happening nationally, and to try to plug into the many different organizing efforts that are happening. I know one big thing that is happening in August is a National Black Convention that's going to be online. I think it's August 20th, where the Movement for Black Lives is convening this gathering. The Movement for Black Lives is an umbrella group of over 100 different Black-led organizations. And so I think that will be an opportunity for people to try to figure out how to plug in. But there seems to be a lot happening in different localities that provide an opportunity for folks to figure out what to do in their particular location to try to start moving on some of this stuff.
Just to kind of belabor the point just a little bit more is that I think part of it, when we think about what the individual can do, we largely think that, I think we get caught up in these kind of conversations about it's the structure, it's everything else, but what can the everyday individual do? And I think part of it is using your political power, and not just in voting, but also organizing, coalition building at your local level, but also using your purchasing power, right? So in ways in which you use your money to buy certain goods and products, but also where you choose to go on your everyday life, there needs to be a radically rethinking this. And part of the other point that I wanted to just kind of put out there is that a lot of times in these conversations, we think we're working for the benefits for the community, and the community has this like very broad term. But we need to realize that each one of us has a different sense of reality. And so when we think about what we're doing for communities, realize that people within the community are articulating the needs that they have themselves. And a lot of times there's a discrepancy or the disparity between what policymakers think communities need versus what community members actually tell you what they need. And a lot of times when we're thinking about we need to drastically, reduce crime and we need to build more housing, a lot of them say, no, I need you to build new schools right now. Housing is not the main issue for us. So there's some tension or some kind of issues when policymakers act on behalf of communities without really seeking communities or valuing the intentions or the knowledge that local communities have for themselves and remaking their communities for the better.
Thank you so much. And, I want to say that hold me accountable too. I'm a dean of a college of 3,000 faculty, students, and staff. And so I think we need to hold our educational leaders accountable in higher education. What are we doing to change this conversation and make this work, the work that you are doing, more readily available to communities? And so I'm going to make a soft announcement here. Next week, we're going to have a huge announcement. We are creating a new civil rights partnership. I can't tell you more about it right now because we're working on an exclusive with one of the large national newspapers. But next week, University of Kentucky, we're going to act. The University of Kentucky College of Education is going to act. So watch our social media channels for a big announcement. I have two final questions here that have been sent to me. One, yesterday we heard a little bit about segregated housing's role in wealth disparities. Can you tell us a little bit more about why and how that works? And then the final question, because we're running short on time here, we have just 5 minutes. We all have PhDs, and I think, we were told not to talk less than 20 minutes at a time. So who are we up against, and how powerful are they? Who are the actual corporate players that profit off of segregation and privatization? Let me toss that first one to Dr. Taylor. So role of segregation and wealth disparities, and how that works. Finally, who are we up against? How powerful are they? And who profits off of segregation?
There's lots of different answers to the first question. I think, how does it work? We look at the way that segregation has, locked African Americans into in its, in an urban or suburban manifestation, in areas that have less plentiful jobs, less well-paying jobs, less access to public transportation, schools that are under-resourced. All of these things contribute to income disparity. It contributes to the opportunities that Black people have access to versus people who are in segregated white neighborhoods who may have, higher property values because of their proximity, away from Black people who have better access to higher paying employment. This is on a very basic level how some of this works. You could look at the work of Patrick Sharkey, who talks about how the sort of disinvested, underinvested places that Black people live generationally remain that way, disinvested, underinvested, and that is part of what some people call a cycle. To me, it's talking about cyclical things sounds too natural, that this is sets of policies and private sector practices that are reinforced every single year. And so, I think the generational wealth comes from the way that Black living spaces are devalued as well. One of my favorite examples is in Chicago, the 60653 zip code is a Southside Black neighborhood that is less than a mile from Lake Michigan. In that neighborhood, Bronzeville, you have homes that are, between 3,000 and 4,000 square feet that are around between $600,000, $700,000. 5 miles north of that location, the same homes in the same condition, newly built, same square footage, are worth more than $1 million. The differential factor is that 60653 is in a predominantly Black neighborhood. And so just by virtue of being Black or living in close proximity to Black people or in a Black neighborhood devalues your property. And that expresses itself through the asset of a home. And so these are the tangible, specific and concrete ways that racism expresses itself in the lives of African Americans on a day-to-day basis. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
I'll take a shot. If you got the time, Julian, I'll take a quick shot at the second question.
You got 20 seconds.
20 seconds. Look, anytime African-American workers of color can be super exploited and wages kept lower, unionization crushed, the private sector attacked across the board. The capitalists in Wall Street profit. The private companies that want to move into the private prison and put more people in prison, private schools, and undermine public education. And we talked plenty about the post office and the potential of what privatization would mean there. So who profits are the capitalists, and the people lose, the communities lose, and the workers lose. And somebody, again, as I said in the beginning, laughs all the way to the bank. And it is very important, I think, as we discuss all these issues, that there really is a profit motive underlying these attacks on the public sector.
Well, I want to thank each of you, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Dimondstein, and Dr.
I'm not a doctor.
Mr. Dimondstein and Dr. Dantzler, so much for joining us this morning. And we look forward to continuing these conversations.
Julian, I'd like to just talk about the next panel. I wanted to thank everybody for coming. We're going to have a panel coming after lunch at 12:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's going to be, is America ready for a second Reconstruction and a third founding? What we're going to have, the featured speakers will be Eric Treanor, who's a great historian of the Reconstruction period, the post-war period, after the Civil War, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and civil rights laws that attempted to move forward. And then Barbara Ramsey will be talking about the second Reconstruction, which really began at the Brown decision and lasted through the early 70s. They're going to say, what lessons can we learn from these periods of intense activity that were followed by long periods of backlash? And as we move into a potential third Reconstruction, what can we learn from this, from history? How can we relate it to modern experience? So that'll be at 12:15. And again, we'd like to thank everyone for coming for this really excellent panel. And we'll be closing now for a little while and having time for a break, but please come back at 12:15 for our panel, Is America Ready for Another Reconstruction and Another Founding? Thank you.